This is my niece Vanessa and her husband Josh. They came up for the weekend and we have 3 days to turn the back of their 94 Landcruiser into a camper van that they can take all the way to Argentina. I am so excited to finally be able to share this video with you guys. This was filmed back in September of this year. Josh and Vanessa came up for a long weekend and we spent a majority of the weekend working through and building out their camper van conversion. On the first night they were here, the biggest job was to make sure that we had the floor in place in the back of the Landcruiser. We used 2 sheets of 1/2-inch Baltic birch and glued those together, which you'll see a little bit later on. The majority of the floor fit perfectly just by using the carpet as a template to make our first layer of the floor. And even though the jigsaw is probably my least favorite hand tool, it got a lot of use that weekend. Now all you've seen us do so far is shape that bottom layer of what will become the floor. We did take this first layer out a couple times before bringing it into the garage when it got too dark to be able to glue it up to what would become the second layer. Now I had a box of this adhesive which was designed for gluing up hardwood floor. And it worked perfectly for gluing up these strips that go on the underside of that first layer. And getting this done the first night was absolutely critical to make sure that we'd be even close to hitting our deadline. So we ended up using 3 tubes of this flooring adhesive, so I don't think this floor is coming apart anytime soon. And you'll notice that we're actually overlapping the seams, so just to add as much strength as we can, and to avoid the 2 seams from lining up one on top of the other. I believe by this time it was about 11 o'clock, and there wasn't really much else that we could do until the next morning.
Hey, Bill. I've got a few. You know what they say, you never have enough clamps.
I've heard that on the docks.
Starting out on our first full day, we know we had to get the floor in place. So I started out by fixing one of my minor cutting mistakes by gluing in a piece that I had previously cut out. Now I thought this was pretty genius. I used the first layer basically as the template to shape the second layer. And to do this, I'm using a 1/2-inch patterning spiral cut bit from Bits and Bits. This was so incredibly satisfying to do, and the bit made short work of making our 2 layers of the floor. Now there's a couple interesting notches that we had to cut out. This one in particular was for the armrest. We want to make sure that we are getting as close to the back seats as possible, so cutting out this space right here made it a lot easier for us to get the floor as close to the 2 front seats as possible. And then back over to the jigsaw so I could cut out the section that I had previously glued in. And the part that I cut out actually became the template for the other side of what needed to be cut out around the wheel well. While I was finishing up the floor, Josh started sealing a lot of the little holes and stuff underneath where the floor would go, just with a bit of silicone. Now let me tell you a little bit more about their Landcruiser. They had this thing called a Camp Tech installed a couple weeks before we did this, and it basically turns it into a Westphalia, which is arguably the best Volkswagen vehicle ever made. You know, you might have thought it was the Punch Buggy, but unfortunately, it is the Westphalia. Anyways, enough stirring the pot. We started sliding the floor in because we had to make sure that we could line up all of the holes for where it would mount to the floor of the Landcruiser. By mid-morning, we had the floor sitting in place and it fit perfectly. Josh was able to crawl underneath the cruiser and just mark exactly where we would need to drill our holes to be able to attach, I believe it was M6 bolts all the way through to mount the floor to the Landcruiser. And the nice thing about these bolts is the placement was actually underneath both the cupboards and the bench. So in the final product, you actually don't see them. But what you would see is the seam between the 2 sheets of plywood. So before painting, we did take a little bit of time just to fill that with Bondo, and all we're doing is painting the floor with Total Boat's Wet Edge. This took a little bit longer to dry than we expected, but gave us a chance to have a little bit longer of a lunch break, which no one was really complaining about. After adding supports to the front of the floor and attaching it for the last time into the cruiser, I started working out and cutting out all the pieces that we would need for the kitchen cupboards. Now I'll do my best to describe which side we're working on, either the driver's or the passenger's side, but the driver's side is where they have their kitchen and food storage area. So again, this is on the driver's side, and what I'm doing now is I'm actually building a little platform. The platform is what the cooler is actually going to sit on, so it's at the right height with the countertop, and it actually worked perfectly as a little cubby that they're able to store the camp stove under. So stick around to a little bit later, and there is a bit of a tour as well. On Josh and Vanessa's channel, they have a video as well that goes through their perspective of this build. With the cooler platform in place, I was able to confirm my measurements of how high the cabinet needed to be, and I was able to start marking out and scribing in my carcass for what would be the kitchen area. Now, in preparation for this build, I watched a lot of overland builds and a lot of van life builds. And the one thing I noticed is some people just don't take the time to scribe in pieces. This isn't a big deal, but the reality is you just get such a tighter fit if you take the time just to be able to shape all of your pieces so it fits perfectly into the vehicle. It doesn't take that much more time, and the final result just looks a lot more finished. There wasn't much else that we could do on the cabinet for the kitchen at this time, so we moved on to the bench side, which actually also includes a fold-out bed. After a quick recap with Josh on how to read a tape measure, we scribed in and we started laying out what would be the bottom rail for the bench. We measured this off the other side just to make sure things were as square as possible. We also scribed everything into place, and at this point I was able to start routing out the grooves for the sliding panel doors, which will go on the bench side. Now, unfortunately, I did not tighten the bit in the Call It Enough on my router and ended up putting a massive mark in my table saw. So, lesson learned, make sure your router bits are always tight. Now, for the offset of the center set of tracks for the panels, I just use these spacer blocks from Rockler, and these need to be offset just so the panels can slide past each other when you need to get anything from underneath the bench. Throughout the whole build, we used these little L brackets that I found. They were just little 1 inch by 1 inch stainless steel L brackets that I honestly have no clue where they came from, but they work perfectly for what we were trying to do.
Smash that like button. Turn that notification bell on. My legs are so cramped. My legs are cramped.
Even after a day and a half of working, we're tired, but for sure still having a lot of fun. I had to cut out what would be the front panel on the bench, and the idea here is there's going to be a cupboard right in front of that, so I took the time to scribe out exactly where that partition for the bench and the cabinet needed to be. I also had to notch out a little section at the bottom just so it had enough room to clear where the rail is at the bottom for the sliding panels. And when I did this, I took some extra time and made sure that the stops on the grooves for the sliding panels ended right underneath where this panel was. This is the true test though.
Oh yeah, Daddy Chris.
She's like banging, man. Anyways. So with that, we were able to start attaching the top rail, and I did this in such a way where the pocket screws were on the opposite side, so they were hidden, and I also made sure that I didn't go through either of the tracks for the sliding panels. This was a really difficult corner to film in, so sorry about the bad angle, but this is probably the best shot you're going to get of what that cupboard ended up looking like. And we left that cabinet open on the backside, so if you needed to, by opening the passenger door, you could still access it from outside the vehicle. The sliding panels went in pretty easily into the tracks. The way I did this is the grooves on the top were deeper than the grooves that were on the bottom, and we just drilled out tiny little holes and actually ended up 3D printing little brackets. So as nice as this shot looks where you see me rounding over this finger hole, we ended up covering it up anyways. Underneath the bench on the passenger side, we also added a shelf. And this shelf, I added a front and back lip too, just so things wouldn't slide around too much when they're driving. And we also made this adjustable. So Josh used the Rockler shelf pin jig, and this makes it so much easier to line up spots where you can add shelf pins. While we were doing that, Vanessa quickly did a couple coats of white paint on the sliding panels. And you can also see that we awkwardly have the shelf shoved in the back. And the reason for that is just way easier, or we found it way easier, to put the shelf in before we sealed it up and put the top onto the bench side. Some of the trim needed to be cut just so it wasn't in the way, but also so it just, again, looked more finished. While Josh was working on this, I measured out and then started to cut out kind of a finish panel that would go right against the cooler on the driver's side of the cruiser. Now, of course, it would have been a lot easier just to do this as one piece all the way from the back to the front on the driver's side in the kitchen area. And I would never recommend trimming something like this in place. Josh likes to sit with the seat pretty far back, so I had to trim the panel in place, which worked out totally fine. At this point, Josh was ready, and I was able to bring in the top for what would be the bench on the passenger side, and we started scribing that out so it fit perfectly underneath the lip of the piece that Josh cut out. So when you're trying to scribe and you don't have a tool, something like this, probably one of the easiest and least expensive things you can do is just get a washer. And literally just by following the ledge, it'll show you where you need to cut. Now on a lot of this I'm going to be okay, but there is some areas in here where I'll need to sneak in a little bit more than I am right now. And by a little bit, I mean a little bit. It was just a wood rasp and a bit of sanding before the bench top was able to slide in just perfectly. Alright, and we're going to use the Total Boat wet edge, which is the perfect diameter to knock down this corner. The bench top was only held down by a couple screws at this point, so I really shouldn't have routed it until it was glued in place. It was flexing a little bit, so there is some blemishes in that front edge, but it does get covered up later on, which you'll see with a piano hinge. So welcome to Monday. This is the last full day that we have for this build, and we've made it pretty far. Pretty happy with the progress so far. Today's going to be all about taking out the bank of cabinets, which is the kitchen area, and installing all the drawers. Now we installed this with the whole front panel in place because we want to make sure that, well, me being picky, we had all the gray orientation the same for the drawers. So a little bit of work to do in the front today, and then we can get on to pulling this out and starting with all the drawers, and that's all the big construction work that has to be done. Hopefully we'll have time for some of the littler stuff too. So let's get back to it. The last job on the bench side was to add the cabinet door for the cabinet that's in front of the sliding panels on the bench. I'll show you a card trick, and this isn't sleight of hand, whatever. I can't do card tricks. Anyways, Josh is down here, and what we're gonna do is he's going to, on this cupboard door, figure out what the gapping is at the top by shoving playing cards in there. Once we know how many cards are gonna be at the top, what he'll do is he's gonna split the deck in half, which will give us exactly the same amount that we'll be able to gap on the top and bottom. This also gave me the perfect placement for where I could add my hinges onto the cabinet door. And I really want to give a huge shout out to Rockler for supporting this video and for being such a longtime supporter of my channel. All the Rockler products that I used in this video are linked below in the description. Once we got it installed, I realized that I needed to add just a slight taper on the front side of the cabinet just because the reveals weren't perfectly even. So I did this trick that I'm not sure if anyone's ever done before, where I put 2 playing cards on the top side of the cabinet door before sliding it all the way through on the table saw. And this worked perfectly and gave us the exact reveals that we were looking for on that cabinet door that no one will probably ever see. With the cabinet door done, we moved on to cutting out the little cubby. And I was pretty nervous to cut this cubby out, mainly because we already had the bench top glued down. But I guess I should have been nervous for other reasons. As a stopper for the cubby, I just glued in a little piece of trim on the underside of the compartment. This piece was held in with CA glue, and I also added some proper wood glue to it, just so it'd have some long-lasting strength. Staying on the bench side of things, I had to cut out the piano hinge that would work as the mechanism for the folding bed. And I want to point out that the folding bed isn't their actual main sleeping bed. I guess if they didn't do the camp tech, this could be the primary bed that they would use, but this is more of an alternative. If they're in a situation where they can't put the camp tech up because it's too windy, or they're trying to be discreet, maybe in a parking lot, they're able to make this as a bed on the lower level and sleep in this. It also, I guess, kind of doubles as a guest room. By the way, I have amazing neighbors, and a couple times throughout this process, I had a neighbor from one side or the other coming over to either lend a hand or just check in on what we were doing. I was pretty thankful for this for a couple reasons. One of the biggest being we worked a couple late nights, so it was better to have the neighbors on board and curious as opposed to angry and, well, you know. The little panel you just saw me cut out was for the controls for the solar power. That was the last piece that I had to do before we moved on to actually building out the kitchen cabinet. As I mentioned earlier, I built this in such a way where we could remove this section, so I was able to cut out each of the drawer faces with the matching grain orientation, which, again, you would never actually notice just because of how far in this is tucked. And unfortunately, I was hitting the stop button instead of the record button, so I didn't get any of the shots of actually cutting out those pieces. But trust me, they got cut out, as you can see here. And at this point, we could start reassembling the carcass for the kitchen area. All the joinery on this was super simple as well. It was just pocket holes that we had clamped in place, and we added some glue just to make sure there was as much strength in the seam as possible. The center panel was inset, so because of this, I had to glue in this tiny little spacer block just so the push to open mechanism wouldn't get bound up on that middle section. If I didn't add this little spacer here, the drawer return on the slides wouldn't have enough clearance to be able to slide back for the drawers to actually open. And getting close to the end of the day, we could start cutting out all the materials required for the 4 drawers that would make up the one side of the kitchen. I always rough cut my materials to approximate width, and then I come back and do final cuts. That way I'm using a smaller piece of material, which is just a lot safer on the table saw. The drawers will be made up of 2 larger bottom drawers and 2 smaller upper drawers. We took a quick break, and I had Vanessa just help me write out a list of all of the parts that we still had to finish before the end of the next day. And as you saw, the first thing on that list was to assemble all of our drawer boxes. This isn't my typical way to do drawers. Typically, I would use 3/4 inch material, and I would do a dado to inset the bottom panel. Because of our time constraints, and because of the weight reduction we were trying to achieve, it was a lot easier to glue a bottom on as opposed to making an inset panel like I would typically do. I set Josh up to build the drawers, and as he was doing that, I went over and I installed the little cubby door with the last little bit of piano hinge that we had. Then I could start cutting out what would be the countertop, and I had to notch out exactly around where the cooler went. And to be honest, I really didn't have to notch out where it went, but for me, I just thought it looked a lot more finished with the little wraparound detail, which you see close to Josh's hand there, that just tucks along that open edge of where the cooler sits. Now, unfortunately, we did run out of time over the long weekend, and Josh and Vanessa were able to stay for an extra day. So when I got home from work that night, we started back at it, finishing off as much of the detail work as we could. I was finally able to install the support strip for where the bed would fold down. And I just cut that piece to length with my track saw and my table saw. From there, we moved inside the cruiser and added the piano hinge, which acts as the mechanism to fold open the secondary bed. And it fit. On the first try, it fit.
Rockler, the way I do it. Okay, now that Josh is done interrupting me, how I set up to do any kind of a push to open drawer slide, like these Aki slides from Rockler, link will be in the description if you're curious about these, is I take a piece of material that's the exact same size as my drawer face, and I make a little spacer block that will fit just perfectly. And the idea is that you need enough gap for the return, so this spacer block right here should just touch our slide. And if it's just touching our slide, we're good.
I showed Josh how to install the drawers and the drawer slides, and I moved on to cutting out some of the little detail molding pieces that were required. We were really up against the clock at this point. We had thought by now we would be putting on finish. So as the night went on, it was all hands on deck just to do as much as we could before they had to leave the next morning. I will say, we did get everything done, except for two things. One of them was an outlet that needed to be cut out that Josh was able to do on his own, and the second was applying finish. I think all of us were zombies for a few days after this, but Vanessa got back to it once they got home and started working on the finishing of all the cabinets. I told her after sanding to use a tack cloth just to pick up all the dust she could off the surface. And then she went about applying Halcyon Clear from Total Boat on all of the surfaces. And after several coats, it was finally done. Aaron and I are so excited for Josh and Vanessa and this adventure that they're about to go on. They mean so much to us, and it was just such an honor that we were able to be a big part of helping them with this van conversion. If you want to see more of their adventures, you can follow them over on their YouTube channel, Destined for Wild. January 1st of next year, they're taking off on their big adventure, so make sure you head over to their channel, subscribe to them, and tell them I say hi. Now don't tell anyone why, but start your comments with Cruiser below, that way I know you made it this far in this video. And I'll be honest, that's such an encouragement for me to see that people are actually watching these videos all the way through. And to be perfectly honest, if I haven't earned your like or I haven't earned your subscription, that's okay too. Just the fact that you made it this far in the video means a lot to me. Now, as a bit of a bonus, just so you know, we're actually going to be starting our own build on our motorhome in the next year. We had some pretty major setbacks with that build. We were actually supposed to do it last winter, but we're on track now to start this in spring of 2023, so if you are subscribed, you'll see that content in that time frame. A massive thanks again to Rockler and to Total Boat for helping out with some of the materials for this build. I'll have links below to both Rockler and to Total Boat, as well as some of the other affiliates that I work with. Y'all really need to know how valuable it is for you to keep supporting the brands that support makers in this community. Good or bad, I answer all the comments, so if you have any questions, make sure you ask below. Watching this back, I can't believe everything we got done just in the one long weekend we had to do this build. I'm really curious to see how this holds up over their trip, so expect a follow-up video in the next year or so. Thanks as always for watching. I've also linked a couple other videos here, so if you want to keep watching, they're all queued up for you, ready to go.